before. A book is like a genie in a bottle.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, time to spring clean your bookshelves and buy a whole of new ones. I'm Cath and Annie.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. Today on Sundoku, we're going to look at a biography of a writer who was around in the Patrick White days in mid-20th century. Her name was Elizabeth Harrower, and she was a fascinating writer, highly regarded, wrote deep, intense psychological books about the times, which makes them particularly interesting, and then she kind of stopped writing. So there's a bit of a mystery what happened to her. She reappeared a few years ago, not long before her death, and turned up at Adelaide Writers' Week, and a lot of her books have been republished since then. So we'll be talking to Susan Wyndham, former literary editor for the Sydney Morning Herald, about the biography that she's written about Elizabeth. And Cath, I've co-opted you. The biography is actually called The Woman in the Watchtower, and that's a reference to the most well-known novel by Elizabeth Harrower. Cath, you've read it for us.
I have, and I'm going to do a proper review. So here we go. Review of The Watchtower by Elizabeth Harrower. It was published in 1966. It was her last full-length piece of writing, and it is harrowing. It's set in Sydney just before and during the Second World War and through the 1940s. And it presents us with two young girls at boarding school, one dreaming of becoming a doctor or an opera singer, and the other 7 years younger, faced with the death of their doctor father and the reality of a new life with an uncaring, spoilt mother in a flat in Manly, and suddenly taking on adult responsibilities and having to sharply rein in their perspectives on the future. Laura goes out to work in a box factory, Claire to college, and their lives fall into a pattern interrupted by the outbreak of war. Their mother decides to return to England to her family, and the girls are hastily disposed of into the care of sinister Mr. Shaw, owner of the factory, who proposes marriage to Laura and takes Claire into his care. Already the reader feels disaster looming, because all these girls know is obedience and duty. And here's a quote from early in the novel. On the sunny, windy wharf beside the big camouflaged ship, with a war in progress, having just been married, saying goodbye to her mother, Laura felt herself falter. None of this, wharf, ship, war, marriage, farewell, was of her planning. Who had constrained her? She felt like an object. So there's Laura. Claire is the dreamer, the reader, portrayed as having an almost mystical rapport with and longing for meaningful encounters with other humans, although the sisters know hardly any, and Felix Shaw is making it his job to keep them from socialising. We get a strong sense that Claire is the writer Elizabeth Harrower, that her openness and vulnerability to the world is the author's own. Here's a lovely paragraph I thought I had to read. A small explosion had revealed to Claire that she was a person to whom one thing was much the same as another, interchangeable because unspeakably important. And another small explosion revealed that this was the way her companions regarded people, that her own singular expectations came from the springs of her being and might be the source of her life's experience, came to her intuition cloudily, chilly, like a portent. So Felix Shaw, who's married Laura, he's a monster. He's 20 years older than Laura. He uses his unpredictability as a weapon to destabilise her and suppress her will. Poor Claire is the onlooker, called in to pour oil on troubled household waters, struggling to keep believing that although she's hemmed in and bullied and restrained, she can continue to call her soul her own because of the impregnability of her inner life. Laura, more confused, less intellectual, the primary object of Felix's inventive cruelties, makes a few feeble efforts to escape but falls back defeated. In part 3 of the book, Felix, who deludes himself he's a man of the world and makes a habit of acting the great benefactor to younger men who keep cheating him blind in business matters, finally brings a young man into the house as his protégé. Claire slowly breaks out of her passivity through becoming useful to this refugee called Bernard. Laura doesn't, and Felix becomes ever more volatile. The Watchtower as a title is a reference to the way Claire feels herself positioned, ceaselessly scanning for danger. The Watchtower feels in no way dated. It's unflinching in a minute account of domestic enslavement and the undisputed tyrant Felix's panoply of twisty mind games. Her understanding of women's early and late conditioning into submissiveness seems entirely contemporary. The writing is superb. The unfolding of the small corrallings and humiliations of the women and the damaged psyche of Felix is observed with amazing detachment and clarity. Sometimes we see the scenes played out, sometimes we hear about them in whispered conversations between the sisters. Their relationship is the linchpin of the novel, but it doesn't provide any magical redemption. Mostly the atmosphere is desperately claustrophobic, and Laura's gradual erasure as a person and reinventing herself as a shadow self to Felix, just occasionally muttering rebellious threats that come to nothing, is unbearable. Patrick White, we know, thought Elizabeth Harrower was a truly gifted writer, and they were good friends. And I think this book is as good as White's domestic narratives and as clear on how domestic tyranny mirrors global evil.
Wow, well, that's The Watchtower, Elizabeth Harrower's most well-known book at the time, and as we said before, disappeared for 4 or 5 decades and reappeared not that long ago. Let's hear now from Susan Wyndham, who's written the biography of Elizabeth Harrower, and I just asked her to tell me a bit about what made her tick.
Elizabeth Harrower was born in 1928 in Newcastle, and she came from a family that was all of Scottish background. They were all immigrants in a couple of generations, and she very much treasured her Scottish background, grew up with a grandmother who sang her all the old songs, and her mother read her English children's stories, and she was very steeped in all that English and Scottish background, which I think had a big influence on her own literary future. And she always spoke about herself as a divorced child who'd never seen a happy marriage when she was young. And her parents were young when they married and split up when Elizabeth was about 7. And her father went off working for the railways off in rural New South Wales. Her mother moved to Sydney and became a nurse, but also married an accountant who was a fabulous character for Elizabeth's writing later in life, but she loathed him. He was a very dodgy businessman who was involved in black marketing and all sorts of phony businesses, and he was awful.
He was a rich character, in other words, wasn't he?
A very rich character. Elizabeth felt that he dominated her mother in a very cruel way that sort of stifled her mother Margaret's own life, and she used this in her fiction, and she also became determined to not submit to any kind of relationship like that in her own life.
She had an unhappy childhood, really, didn't she? And that actually was a rich source for the kinds of books she wrote. Can you kind of talk about what was her drive when she began writing? What did she write?
She travelled with her mother and stepfather, who had enough money to travel in style, on a ship to England in 1951. And it was really just going to be a holiday and to visit relatives, but Elizabeth saw this as her escape route. And when her parents returned to Australia, Elizabeth stayed in London. She had a a Scottish cousin, Margaret Dick, who she got on with extremely well, and they shared a love of literature, and they both wanted to be writers. And she just wrote furiously. I don't think she'd even particularly planned a writing career. When she stayed in London, she was thinking of studying psychology, but she found the whole sort of academic approach to human nature rather dry, and she thought she could study it much better through fiction. She loved the Russian novelists, she loved all the classics, and you can see all this in her own writing. So she started with a short story. Her second short story grew very rapidly into her first novel, Down in the City, which she described as a little love letter to Sydney. I think she was missing Sydney. She was remembering it fondly because she wasn't there. So in her little flat in central London, with gloves and hat on to stay warm, holding a hot water bottle, she wrote about sunny Sydney. And it was a portrayal of the kind of marriage that her mother and stepfather had had. And it showed the crossing of classes. A sort of wealthy woman, for a young woman from Rose Bay, marries a kind of King's Cross, low-level crook, and becomes part of a community of people living in a block of flats in King's Cross. And that was a kind of template, in a way, for all her books. She wrote about domestic dramas, psychological dramas, usually through marriage, always through family, and always against a kind of background of class and gender issues, even though these were not spelt out, but very powerfully dramatised.
How were her books received at the time?
They were published in London by an English publisher, Castle, at first. So it was a strange kind of limbo for Australian writers then, and the fact that she was living in London meant she was a little bit betwixt and between the two countries. However, she was always reviewed. I mean, she found a publisher straight away and put 3 books out in quick succession, and they were always reviewed by the major newspapers there and here. And gradually, the rather brief and mixed reviews that she was getting turned into very strong reception, both there and especially in Australia. So, I mean, she was getting serious attention here because she was part of a movement which led to comparisons with Patrick White, away from the old sort of documentary socialist novels that were being written by the generation before her, to a more psychological, metaphysical kind of internal modernist novel almost. So she was seen as a bit of a groundbreaker at the time. And by the time she came back to Australia and started writing here in 1959, she was really seen as one of our up-and-coming, exciting writers.
So I guess the question is what happened, because she basically sank pretty well without trace at a certain point in her life, didn't she?
She did. Everyone was expecting great things. In 1966, she published her 4th novel, The Watchtower, which most people think is her masterpiece. She'd been building up to it, and I certainly think it's her masterpiece, although I love each of the books for different reasons. And this book really was taken very, very seriously. In Australia, it put her in the top rank of novelists, and people were expecting the next great thing from her. And then she kind of stopped.
I'm interested in the fact that at that point she got a literary fellowship, which is quite a good thing to get in those days. It was very hard, probably still is, to make a living as a writer. And that was very exciting, £6,000, which was almost $100,000 in today's money.
Yes.
But that seemed to be almost like what stopped her.
It was a factor, I think. It was £6,000 a year for 2 years. So it really did give her quite an advantage. But she had to be pushed into that by friends. Judah Watton, a Melbourne communist writer who was very close to her, urged her along to apply for it. And Patrick White was always urging her, and Kylie Tennant, who she worked with and became a very close friend, was supporting her to do all these things. And so she almost reluctantly said, okay, I'll apply. And she got the fellowship, and she did complete another novel, but it took her a long time. And in that time, she had a lot of personal problems. Her mother died quite suddenly, which really rocked her. She felt, well, great grief, as she would, and also some guilt, I think, about having not cared quite enough for her mother. And her father, who she'd reconnected with, also died. Her stepfather died. She was having problems with friendships that were complicated, and she was involved in other people's lives and problems. And all of this was a great distraction. And the book that she produced, which would later be published, it was received by her publisher as somewhat formulaic and a little bit wooden, not as powerful as the earlier books she'd written. And she made the decision to withdraw it from publication in 1971. And that pretty much marked the end of her publishing career for a long, long time, for 40 years, though not her writing career. She did go on. She got another literary grant. She did fiddle around and start other novels and published a couple of short stories. But, you know, she was in her 40s and she lived until she was 92. And there was this long, long, long dry period.
It's so interesting. She was having a pretty intense social life in those years too. I almost felt that distracted her to the point that she couldn't get back to writing. Or whether she'd written everything she had to write, is that a possibility as well, that she was no longer driven?
I think both are true. I think in those first 4 books she had written out all that anger and sorrow and intense striving emotional material that she'd stored up through her early life. Not that her books are entirely autobiographical, but there is certainly material taken from her life, from her grandmother, from her mother, her stepfather, and various other people around her. And I think she reached a point where she was having to draw on more current observation, which she was very good at, but it just didn't have that urgency or that organic feeling that the earlier books did. And I think she was also perhaps drawing on friends around her, and it was a bit awkward to publish about them, where they may have recognized themselves. And also times were changing. You know, Elizabeth never called herself a feminist, but as the 60s progressed and the 70s began, feminism was becoming, obviously an opportunity for women writers, and there were people like Helen Garner publishing, and Kate Jennings and Kate Grenville, and all these new generation of women started to appear, and there were publishers looking for women's books. It should have been an opportunity, but Elizabeth said to me at one point, well, things changed very rapidly. And in fact, I had written a lot by then, and I think she didn't feel quite part of this changing scene. Also, she had built up a very lively social life, as you say, and she had these great, interesting friends, and she enjoyed entertaining. And I think after a while, writing became hard. The remuneration wasn't very great for it, and she just decided to enjoy her life, I think.
Was there something darker going on though? Because there is a quote that you put in the book when she said, "That's when I decided to destroy my life." And there's a certain diffidence and lack of confidence somewhere that comes across in a lot of the letters she was writing to people at the time. Like, she throws it off in a humorous way, but, you know, she obviously finds it very difficult to get back down to writing, because I almost felt because she wasn't confident that she could produce anything better.
Yes, I think that is partly true. I think Elizabeth had confidence in her writing. She certainly believed in the books that she had published, and even in certain circles, which came out in 2014 eventually when Michael Hayward reissued all her books. She believed that they should be seen again. But I do think that almost her own reputation and the expectations of her were putting pressure on her that she perhaps didn't feel she could fulfill. And she did have people like Patrick White looking over her shoulder with affection and support, but that can be a pressure in itself. I just think that she had poured out so much. She also allowed herself, as Patrick White said, to be sucked dry by vampires in her life. Now, that's a dramatic way of putting it, but she did seem drawn to rather difficult, demanding friends. And she became friends in Potts Point with Shirley Hazard's mother, Kit Hazard, who was living alone and who was gradually sort of descending into mental illness and old age. And while Shirley was living in the United States, in New York and in Italy, and writing her books and travelling with her husband, Elizabeth became almost a proxy daughter and carer to Kit. And that became quite a demanding relationship. And Elizabeth allowed herself to be drawn into it very deeply. So she was doing all kinds of things for Kit. And at the same time, she had been very good friends with Kylie Tennant, and Kylie had been helpful to her. Kylie was a well-known author of an older generation, and she'd helped Elizabeth get a job in the office at Macmillan Publishers. They'd bought a house together at Blackheath where they ostensibly went to write. But Kylie had a disabled and depressive husband. She had a drug-addicted son. She had a daughter with learning difficulties, and all of these things seem to consume their lives and times. And I think it drove Elizabeth a little bit mad. There's a very complicated period where she's trying to extract herself from Kylie and her family and their dramas, and yet she has great sympathy and gets pulled back in again and again and again. So you see these opposing forces, and I think she regretted a lot of that later.
Although she wasn't a feminist, obviously at the time men still ruled the literary scene. There was a lot of gatekeeping in terms of what got published and what didn't, and what people said about what you wrote. And also somewhere in a letter she talks about at a certain point in women's lives, something appears that she called it a cement pyramid in the middle of the road. I thought that was a fascinating thing about it was a bit like the glass ceiling. It isn't that easy for a woman to fulfill her dreams.
That's right. That's a quote from In Certain Circles, the last novel, which she was writing, I think, with a bit of a view to feminism developing and giving women a hope of independence at the end of that book. Yeah, I mean, I think that cement pyramid could be all sorts of things. It could be marriage, it could be children, it could be the, as you say, the domination by men of the professional and creative worlds. There were a lot of obstacles. I mean, that puts a very negative spin on it all. She also had a lot of help from men, and she liked men. She was not angry at men in general. She had a lot of male friends and lovers, who I found out a certain amount about. But she certainly saw how hard it was, and women all around her were struggling. So I think, it's now a fairly conventional feminist view, and you would say there was an element of feminism in her understanding of the restrictions on women's lives.
On reading this book, you are immersed in an era, and there were so many people writing and so many women writing, and a lot of it published, and it all seems to have disappeared without trace, and yet it is a wonderful record of life in the 50s and 60s in Australia.
Yes. While I was working on the book, I got round to reading books I hadn't got to before, including Tiralira by the River by Jessica Anderson, which I thought was an extraordinarily beautiful portrait Sydney and Brisbane at that time, a bit earlier than Elizabeth's novels, but other people like Terrace, and there were lots of them coming up. Elizabeth, I think, writes very atmospherically about Sydney and Newcastle and London in her books. You get the weather, you get the harbour in Sydney. People are always catching ferries. She was delighted when the war ended in Sydney. She was a teenager, and she remembered the day or the night that all the neon lights came back on and the street lights after all the blackouts of the war. And she just delighted in all this and going to cafes and, her novels can be quite bleak, but she actually took a lot of pleasure in life and had great happiness and a great sense of humour. And all of this pervades her writing.
Now, you developed a relationship with her late in life. Can you talk about what she was like?
Oh, I felt so privileged. It came about because I was literary editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, and I actually interviewed her for the first time in 1996 when she won the Patrick White Award, which Patrick had funded with his Nobel Prize money, and it was given each year to a writer who had made a great contribution to Australian literature but hadn't had sufficient recognition. And I had never even heard of Elizabeth at that point. I hadn't, of course, read any of her books, but I enjoyed talking to her on the phone briefly, wrote a story, and then still didn't get round to reading the books until they were coming out, a decade or so ago. And as literary editor, again, I made a point of going over and interviewing her in person in 2014 when In Certain Circles was published. And I was so impressed. She was 86 then. She was still as bright as anything, engaged in the world, not terribly interested in talking about herself or these books that she hadn't read for 40 years or so, as she claimed. But she was a very intelligent, curious person who I just got on well with. And we shared various things. My parents were divorced. My father's background was Scottish. We had lots of things to talk about personally, as well as books and writers. And she loved talking about her friends. She adored Judah Watton. She adored Patrick White. She had a whole range of people that she was kind of mourning at that stage because most of them had died, and she was quite alone in the world, and none of her old writer friends were there to see her have this moment of glory. But we developed a nice friendship in the last few years of her life, and I would go over and have afternoon tea with her every now and then, and she always went out and bought pastries and sat me on a sofa looking out at her harbour view. And I'd spend a couple of hours there, and I enjoyed it so much. She was a woman of my mother's generation too, and I always feel a connection with women like that because they were a generation who had to fight their own quiet battles to have a life of independence, and there is a woman who had really done it.
It's a marvellous, vibrant picture of an era as much as of Elizabeth herself too. So look, well done for bringing her back to life.
Oh, thank you very much, Annie.
Susan Wyndham, former literary editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, talking about the book she's written about the author Elizabeth Harrower, and that book called The Woman in the Watchtower. And thanks again, Cath, for actually reading the book. And it sounds like such a dark read, I have to say. I don't think it's going to be on my Sundoku.
Harrowing, and yet it's such a brilliantly written book. We should read it. I think we all should read it.
What have you been reading?
Well, slightly less elevated reading, although I will stand up for this series. Shamini Flint is an author who I think is based in Singapore. She's a human rights lawyer. She's been involved in all sorts of interesting human rights programs around Asia. And she's invented a police inspector called Inspector Singh of the Singapore police, a little bit of a thorn in the side of his superiors. He's the kind of rogue inspector. And she sends him on missions to various countries that she herself knows very well. So Malaysia, Cambodia, Singapore itself, a Bali one set just after the Bali bombings. And the one that I just picked up from the library is called A Very English Execution. It's a terrific story. They're great. They're well written and ripping yarns, but it basically focuses on homegrown terrorism among second-generation Indian boys in London. It's terrific. I think she's wonderful. And there's a new series coming to BBC or ITV with Sanjeev Bhaskar, who we know from Unforgotten and the Kumars at Number 42, and they're going to make him Inspector Singh, and I cannot wait to see that. And Annie, how about you?
Well, I had to do a bit of travelling, so I actually shelled out full tote odds for Ian McEwen's new book because I do love him as a writer. And it's called What We Can Know, partly set 100 years in the future, and fascinating to see how he's interpreted that. And the second half becomes a literary thriller. We never go back to the future, which I was a little bit disappointed with, but it creates some really beautiful ethical problems, and it's incredibly easy to read. I loved it.
Easy to read. Wow, that's interesting.
I love reading his books. I remember the book he wrote, Saturday, where he wrote an entire book about one day, and I was in awe of how he could do that and
wonderful.
Keep it interesting. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about homegrown terrorists a little while ago. Speaking of homegrown, I've picked up The Death of Dora Black by Lainie Anderson, a petticoat police mystery that is set in our very own Adelaide in 1920, and the main character is a reanimated Fanny Kate Boadicea Cox, who became the first policewoman in the British Empire employed on the same salary as men and with the same powers of arrest.
True story.
True story. Well, at least she's a real person, but the story itself is invented. It's a very good read. It's well done, and apparently Lainie Anderson is a writer who, well, you know, and I've come across her name, 35 years in journalism and public relations, and she's been researching the life of Kate Cox. And
we will chase her up.
Check her out, the details about things in Adelaide that we will nod and think, oh yes, where did that ever go?
And there's nothing like reading something set in a place that you know.
A whole lot of it is in Moore's department store, which is where the Supreme Court building is now, and that we both remember, I'm sure, very, very precisely from our youth.
I used to work there in the school holidays. And it is so nice, isn't it, to read something that's set in your hometown, but it's also so wonderful to read about a place that you never read about. So I picked up Half of a Yellow Sun, which was written back in the early 2000s by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and it's set in Nigeria, which had at that point had about 60 or 70 years of colonial rule and was heading very rapidly towards revolting, but there were several very complicated political story, but most wonderful book, a marvellous look at a life that you would know nothing about. Brilliantly, beautifully written, just takes you there completely. I'm just so enjoying that.
And the overlapping of traditions and modernity, which is really what Shamini Flint is good at as well. Yeah.
Those sort of books that take you away, which is what reading's all about. So keep reading, and time for us to go, Cath.
Thank you, Annie, and keep listening. If you feel moved to send us your thoughts on any book that you are reading, just go to sundocast@gmail.com and send us a recording of your thoughts. We'd love that. So thanks for your company once again. I'm Cath Keneally.
And I'm Annie Hastwell.
And we'll see you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Cath Keneally,
Michaela Andreev, Sarah Martin,
And me, Annie Hastwell. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU cast.